professor at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. I should add on a personal note, he was also a Parker visiting scholar at Brown University when I was a graduate student there. That's when I first met Alan. Some time ago, but I won't say when. His talk today is entitled Out of Her Shell, The Birth of Helen in Greek Art. Please join me in welcoming Helen Shapiro.
Sure. Thank you, Joe, for that very nice introduction. You probably saw Christchurch, New Zealand on the news in the last day in ruins and rubble, and we're actually rather concerned because the university where I did spend 3 years has what they like to claim it was the best collection of classical antiquities in the southern hemisphere, certainly one of the best, and it suffered already in the September earthquake that they had, and this was a real shock. Hit again and worse, so I'm sort of waiting for some. I have a feeling that most of the antiquities were still packed away. Anyway, there is a slight New Zealand connection here, but very slight. Anyway, the project, I'm very delighted to be here. I don't often get to interact with practicing artists or art students, and I would say this is somewhat unstructured talk, so that if you have a question pertaining to something that's on the screen, I don't mind being interrupted. This project grew out of 2 exhibitions, one of which I think will be very familiar to you, and the other of which probably less familiar. The familiar one is the Heroes show, which was organized here at the Walters about a little over a year ago. I hope many of you saw that show, and I was not much involved, although it's very much the topic that I'm interested in, as you've heard. I didn't have direct involvement, but indirectly I would take a very tiny bit of credit in that as the then curator, Sabina Alrosmeyer, was organizing it, I said, well, you know, heroes, people think Heracles, Theseus, Jason, and always male. But what about the female, or female heroes, heroines, who are essentially part of the same phenomenon? And she said, okay, and Helen, in fact, was featured in the show as a prototype of a heroine in the Greek sense of the term. The other show that I said you more likely will have missed, because it was only on in Malibu, California, Getty. This is, I don't know if some of you may be familiar, but in 2006, this villa, which is a replica of a villa near Pompeii, was reopened, and with the addition of this wonderful outdoor theater, and partly to go along with that, this exhibition of theater-related antiquities was mounted last summer and fall. We did get to see a production. You might recognize the actress Olivia Dukakis there playing Clytemnestra and Sophocles' Electra. So, and Helen featured in both exhibitions. Here is a piece that was on exhibit at the Walters for the Heroes show. One of a large number of Greek vases made in the 4th century, we'll come back to all this, that show Helen breaking out of the shell. And this one adds a wonderful detail that she seems to be holding a miniature egg, almost as a kind of meta-theatrical gesture or a sort of play on the circumstances of her birth. And here is my surprise that somebody's already anticipated me in. As you may recall, Lady Gaga's appearance about a week ago at the Grammys, where she emerged from the egg. Whether she was thinking of Helen, I hadn't heard. But anyway, this is just to show you that the theme is still timely. And in fact, their favorite myths had to do with unusual, unorthodox births of gods or heroes. The circumstances of birth are always unusual. So Athena was born out of the head of Zeus, and the god Hephaestus had to split open his head, and that's why you see the axe. The god Dionysus was born out of the thigh of Zeus, or rather, thigh. Right? Just as you see the head of baby Dionysus emerging. Long story short, the mother of this god Dionysus was a mortal who was burned to a crisp when she saw Zeus in all of his glory, and so he rescued just the fetus that he was carrying and brought it to term in his thigh. One of many not very biologically correct myths, but among the favorites that the Greeks like to represent. Here a detail of the vase that we'll see in its entirety later on, but I bring it partly because she is breaking out of the shell, and also because the eagle, the symbol of Zeus, is very pronounced in this particular scene. Just to show you how tremendously popular this myth was, we have it depicted, as I'll show in a moment, in the 5th century BC, and we have it still being depicted in a Roman town on the Mosel River in Germany in this remarkable mosaic. And here we get a kind of X-ray view into the egg, but instead of just Helen, there are 3 babies in there waiting to be born, and the mosaicist has conveniently labeled them for us as Castor and Pollux, also known as the Dioscuri, twin sons of Zeus and brothers of Helen. Well, excuse myself for this rather inelegant bottle of water, but I guess it's become dirtier. I see people drinking. So what is quite amusing in a way is that the mosaicist, 400 or so AD, has really, some things he got right, but his spelling is very odd. Eilena, this should be Leda, L-E-D-A. He got the spelling wrong. And here he got the whole label wrong. This figure should be Tindarius. We'll see him on several earlier vases, but he's put in Agamemnon instead. What is going to be very important for what I'm going to propose to you is the idea of Helen and her 2 brothers all being born at the same time, an alternate version of the story. So what is the story of how Helen came to be born out of an egg? The original story, going back to the earliest Greek sources, takes place here in Attica, the region. Here is Athens, the capital, and here at Rhamnus, slightly misspelled on this slide, Rhamnus, on the coast of Attica, is where the myth is set. And the local deity at Rhamnus was a goddess called Nemesis, just like our modern word. Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, retribution. And she was one of many victims of Zeus's lust. He went after her. Being a goddess, she was able to transform herself into different shapes. Now, there is no ancient imagery of Zeus and Nemesis, but I show you this just to illustrate how the Greeks dealt with this theme of metamorphosis, of transforming. This is Peleus and Thetis, the future parents of Achilles. And because Thetis is a goddess, she's able to turn herself into a lion or a snake. But, of course, showing the act of metamorphosis is much more difficult for an artist. And so the Greek vase painter does it kind of symbolically. In the case of Zeus and Nemesis, she turned herself into a bird, swan, I think, or goose, and he turned himself into a swan and consummated their relationship, and thus Helen was the offspring of Zeus and Nemesis, but in the form of birds, and this is why she's then born out of an egg. But the story, I'm afraid, gets more complicated than that. I mean, once again, this one that we saw earlier is typical of what happened to the story in the 4th century BC and among the Greek colonists of southern Italy. I'll say more about that in a moment. Well, actually, this is a good time to. After giving you some background, most of this talk is going to deal with vases made, as I said, by Greek workshops, but transplanted to South Italy. And they go by names like Apulian, which had its center at Taranto and Paris, Lucanian, Campanian, and here, this will be relevant, is a city called Poseidonia, which is nowadays known as Paestum, site of famous Greek temples, which we'll also have occasion to mention. So I'll really be talking mostly about Greek vases made in the 4th century BC in these regions of South Italy. However, before we can get there, and this is one. So somewhere in Apulia, on the eastern coast of South Italy, there was a workshop that produced what are known as Pliax vases that seem to capture a certain kind of local comic theater production. You see that they're on stage, right? So it is a production, and this is the vase that kind of inspired what I'm going to talk to you about, because it traveled to the Getty from Bari, was exhibited there, and it remains sort of unique in terms of a comic theatrical depiction based on the birth of Helen, as you see her emerging from the egg. But everything else about this scene is something of a mystery to scholars, although the vase has been known for a long time. Why is this figure holding up an axe, seeming to threaten the child? Who is this? And the woman that left. So we make a suggestion about all that a little bit later on. Okay, so as iconographers, if I may use that term, always ask, when does a myth first appear in ancient art, and under what historical circumstances? In the case of the birth of Helen, it first appears around the year 430, right just as the Peloponnesian War has broken out. But we spoke about Nemesis being the mother at Rhamnus in Attica, but somewhere along the line, this egg has been brought to Sparta in the Peloponnesus. We know that from various inscriptions, and also because here we have the cast of characters. Helen is still in her shell. Notice she hasn't broken out yet. But clearly something dramatic is about to happen, because everybody looks a little bit on edge here. And in particular, we see this royal couple, Leda and Tyndareus. These are the king and queen of Sparta in the myth, as well as the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux or Polydeuces in Greek. So this is clearly a different version from the one the mosaicist was working off of, because the Dioscuri are already grown young men when Helen was born. So there's clearly something something we've missed here. How did this egg that was conceived and laid, or not laid, but up in Attica, how did it end up down in Sparta in the care of the royal family? I think the answer to that, here's also a very nice version on a cup in Boston, where again that eagle, far earlier than the mosaic, or here around 400 BC, that the eagle again. And the egg, notice, is always on an altar. Which is a little odd. Someone suggested an interesting explanation to me, typical decorating Greek altar, that altars are always warm because it's where sacrifices with fire, burned offerings take place, and so the warmth of the altar perhaps was helpful in gestation of this egg. To come back to the question, what happened? Well, we have this tiny fragment of a play written by a comic playwright. Now, you probably know the name of Aristophanes, but the other rivals of Aristophanes are much less well known, such as this man Plotinus. But we do know that he staged a play called Nemesis, and from that alone we could guess that it was probably about the conception and birth of Helen. And sure enough, it introduced the character of Leda. The speaker of these lines is probably the god Hermes, and he's saying, Leda, this is your talent. Presumably the egg is there on the stage. This is your task. With grace and dignity, let yourself be no different in your ways from a hen. Notice he's using very highfalutin language for this preposterous story. That's part of the humor. Brooding on this so you can hatch us a beautiful and admirable bird from this egg. So somewhere along the line, the egg was brought to Sparta. And we happen to know, although there's practically nothing else left of this play, we know from other sources that it was staged right around the time the Peloponnesian War broke out, which was in 431. And conveniently enough, the vases start in the aftermath of that production. So we seem to have a case of theatrical influence. And we also have a second, not coincidental set of circumstances, that at Rhamnus, this very site where the myth takes place, they were building a temple to Nemesis in the same period of around 430. Only its foundations survived, but we know it was a fairly impressive temple. And like all Greek temples, it had a cult statue inside it of the goddess. This is how it would have looked based on a combination of Roman copies, and remarkably enough, a Greek scholar, archaeologist who was rummaging around in the British Museum about 40 years ago, found what turned out to be part of the original head. So we have here probably the only example of a surviving ancient cult statue, even in fragments. A kind of unique situation. The travel writer Pausanias visited this site in the 2nd century AD, and he tells us that on the base were a number of figures, and that the theme of the base, of these bas-relief figures on the base, was Helen being introduced to her birth mother, Nemesis, by her stepmother, Leda. So that would be probably the three women here. In fact, some bits and pieces of this base also survive in a storeroom at Rhamnus. You don't see too much here. You can see they're very battered. But the point I want to make is that what the Athenians seem to be doing when they built this statue and put in a temple with the statue is to claim Helen as an Athenian because her mother Nemesis gave birth to her at Rhamnus. Whereas the Spartans, because the Spartans were the enemy at this point, and they probably claimed Helen because in Homer, Helen is associated with Sparta. She's the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. So we seem to have a kind of political tug-of-war going on with this myth as well. This is a very peculiar, unusually shaped, it's also quite large, big. We don't exactly know what it was used for, but we do know from stylistic criteria that it was made in Sparta. There was not much production of these red figure vases in Sparta. This seems to be one, and sure enough, it seems to be making the counterclaim that Helen is born here as a Spartan heroine, her father Zeus, Leda here, and then the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, with their horses. And in Sparta, these twin heroes are especially associated with horses. Now we jump over the sea to South Italy, and one thing we can say is that the Attic vases regularly showed that moment when the egg is intact. The Spartan one, she was breaking out, and here in South Italy, she is always emerging from the shell, which already suggests maybe some change in the transmission of this motif and of the myth. Here is one of the most elaborate and really quite spectacular versions of the story from this workshop at Keston. In fact, the painter even signed it. His name was Python. And it was made at Keston and also found at Keston about 40 years ago. And many people have wanted to see some theatrical influence behind this vase as well, because of these very elaborate costumes. He's helpfully labeled everyone, although by now we would have recognized Leda here, Tiberius here. Helen, as usual, reaches her arms out to her foster mother. And then he's added figures on a higher plane. The most interesting for us is the goddess Aphrodite. When you think about Aphrodite, we remember that she has an interesting connection to Helen, because at the so-called Judgment of Paris, it was Aphrodite who won the prize, and it was Paris who received Helen as his prize. And here, I can show you one of many ancient depictions where the three goddesses come to Mount Ida. Here's the young Paris, and notice that Aphrodite sort of leads the way. She has a little Eros with her. She's clearly the winner. So as I said, I think it's not unimportant that Aphrodite is included here. You could even imagine a play in which Aphrodite spoke to just to contrast two different workshops in South Italy, the one in Puglia on the left, and the eastern one, much more elaborate, on the right. But certain things seem to remain constant, that Helen is sort of half out of the shell, and that she's reaching toward her new mother. Something a little different here. The story of Leda and the Swan will be known to you from many works of art that stretch from the 4th century BC to probably present. And Cezanne, I could have shown with Leonardo, a very popular motif. And when we stop to think about it, this version must be somewhat different from the story that I told you a moment ago, because in this version, Leda is the birth mother. She is raped by Zeus in the form of a swan, and she gives birth to Helen. So this is a totally different alternative from the Nemesis story. The Nemesis story is the one I like to call the anatomically correct version, because two birds have intercourse and the female lays the egg. it's much less plausible or less anatomically correct that a human, a female, should be raped by a bird and then give birth to an egg. So, nevertheless, that is the clear implication of these scenes. And interestingly, it turns out that this is not a particularly old myth like the Nemesis version, but the first time it's ever referred to is in a play of Euripides. So we're here around 415 BC. And what leads me to suspect that Euripides has in fact invented this alternate version is that Helen herself seemed baffled by the circumstances of her birth. This is Helen speaking right near the beginning of the play. There's a story that Zeus flew to my mother Leda in the shape of a swan who was fleeing from the eagle and had his way with her by treachery, if that story is reliable. Helen's a very conflicted figure in this play. And even more dramatically, no woman, either Greek or barbarian, is hatched from the white envelope that contains young birds. Yet thus Leda bore me to Zeus, or so they say. So she's having a little bit of an identity crisis here. And what I suspect is that Euripides is telling the audience, you all know the story of Helen born from Nemesis that drowned Zeus, but I'm going to tell you how it really was. This is the great thing about Greek myths, is that they can be easily modified or reworked. So one suggestion I'd like to make, we know that Euripides plays were wildly popular in South Italy. They were revived, there were road companies, if you will, and we have actually a lot more vases from South Italy that show Euripidean tragedies than we do from Athens itself. So this is one reason I think these Ida scenes are so popular. And in that context, I want to show you what I think is a really sensational piece, a vase from that Apulian workshop. Obviously a different workshop from the one that made the comic Fleax vases. But you may, those of you who wandered through the galleries of the Walters, remember that there's a gigantic Apulian red figure crater. It is the main vase of the Baltimore painter, so named by the great scholar, E.D. Trendle, but it's sort of an honor for us, a painter named after our city. This is not by the Baltimore painter, but it's by an exact contemporary of the Baltimore painter, working around 330 BC. And what I find particularly remarkable about this vase is that it depicts the same god, Zeus, twice, once in his anthropomorphic form and once as a bird in the lower scene. So let me just quickly walk you through this scene, and then we'll come back to the comic versions. Up above, and the painter has helpfully supplied all the names, Zeus is consulting with Aphrodite. She holds Eros, her constant companion, and she holds a kind of love. It's a wheel. It's something they use for love magic. It has a wonderful Greek name. It's called an eons. So we know that the topic of their conversation must be that Zeus has become infatuated with yet another mortal woman and is going to Aphrodite for advice. And this odd figure with Zeus's thunderbolt and a flaming torch, I think, is meant to show that Zeus is literally inflamed by his desire. And that is indeed consummated in the lower scene, where he has turned himself into a swan with Leda, whose name is written there. But what is so striking, I think, is that this hardly looks like a rape. Leda looks all too eager to enter into this relationship. She's not, she's very voluminously dressed, hardly naked as she was in the statue we saw earlier. She seems to rush toward, look how the swan stands on tippy-toe so that their mouth and beak can meet in a kiss. This is the only, so far as I know, ancient depiction of Leda and the swan in a sort of larger narrative context. All the others are like the statue group I showed you with just the two protagonists. Notice that Helen's companion is not so enchanted by the swan. She's fleeing away. But if we try to understand why Leda is so enraptured, the swan, we get a hint, I think, from this figure here. No, he's asleep, god of sleep. So it's almost like a dream, or that Leda is hypnotized by the swan. How to understand that? I think we need to look at the Greek vase in its totality. And on the back of this one, we see that this vase was actually made to go into a tomb. It's a shape that was used in funerary rituals. It was made to go to a tomb of a young woman. And here we see her on the other side. And far from looking sad or grieving for herself, she looks like she's in a kind of happy, ecstatic trance. And so the suggestion I would make is that Leda, being swept up by a god, is a kind of mythological analog for the deceased woman and for her family that placed this in her tomb. So this is Leda and the Swan in a rather serious version. I would say if there was any play that lay behind this vase, I don't think it was a comedy. And in contrast to that, we have a fleax vase. That strange term, fleax, refers to the costume that these characters wear, with sort of pantyhose and a loose kind of smock, and always this artificial phallus that would get a laugh, probably just by itself, and masks. They surely wore masks with caricature faces. That's what makes this fleax. So, as I said, the question is, what was the storyline of the play that inspired this painter? The gesture of the threatening Helen, the fact that she's not on an altar, but she's in a kind of big wicker laundry basket, must have figured in the play. The fact that someone here seems to be interrupting or saying, don't do it. And then a woman almost hiding in the doorway and looking on. Well, most people have assumed that these are Tindarius and Leda, but in caricature, it's going to get a lot darker. Well, the slides will look good. There's general agreement that this should be parody figures, travesties of Leda and Tindarius, and that this one is most likely to be a slave. I say that because his mask, we can find in lots of other objects, terracotta figurines that depict and slaves were often wily slaves were figured prominently in these comedies. But this is about as far as the scholarship had gotten. But we have no fragments, unless we had the fragments of Plotinus of this play. So let's step back for a moment. remind ourselves that in the Athenian vases, and here's another one on your left, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, are grown young men when they're a little washed out, but here's the egg on the altar. But the story that the mosaicists knew had all three of them born at the same time, Helen and her twin brothers. So looking through the various ancient bits and pieces of ancient writers, I noticed that there was a version of the myth in which Leda sleeps with two different men in the same night and conceives children by both of them. That is, she sleeps with the god Zeus, comes in disguise, and also with her husband Tyndareus. So Helen is the offspring. Don't ask how this works biologically, but it's a myth. She has offspring. She gives birth to this egg, and Helen is her child by Zeus, and the other two by Tyndareus. Now, if that sounds implausible, you may recall that there is another myth along these very same lines, and that is the myth that has to do with the conception of Heracles, the most popular of all Greek heroes. Namely, I'm sorry, it's dark, but it's dark. Heracles was born under similar circumstances. His mother, Alcmene, was visited in the night by Zeus, disguised as her husband. And then, once Zeus had left, her real husband appeared, and you can imagine the confusion that led to, and she produced twins, Heracles and his brother Iphicles. And I show you this vase because it illustrates that Heracles, the hero, the one with the divine father, is able to strangle a pair of snakes very nonchalantly, snakes that Hera has sent to destroy him, whereas the mortal child is terrified and reaches for his mother. This myth we know quite well from both literary and archaeological sources, and here most famously on a vase from Paestum, where the story has been turned into a kind of averted tragedy or disaster. That is that Alcmene, her husband, Amphitryon, has suspected her of infidelity because of the way she reacts when he comes to her. And he is setting her on a pyre to which they're setting fire, but she is miraculously saved at the last minute by some goddesses pouring water.
What is this again, please?
I'm sorry.
Who's?
This woman is Alcmene, the mother of Heracles. This is a slight digression. What I'm trying to do is establish the myth of the motif of a mother giving birth to children by two different husbands. And here is Alcmene's mortal husband, who is about to set the punishment for her infidelity. But as we see here, the story does have a happy ending. But it probably was a play, a tragedy, but without a tragic ending. And we know, in fact, Euripides' Helen that I quoted from earlier is a tragedy with a happy ending. So this is something that we find in the later 5th and 4th, early 4th century. We also know that the same story of Alcmene, the mother of Heracles, could be travestied, could have been the subject of comedies, because here we see it on another of these Fleax vases, where this is probably Zeus bringing a ladder, and his accomplice is Hermes, and here's Alcmene up there, a little bit like the scene in Don Giovanni where he serenades her below. So you can see that a myth can go either way. It can have a tragic, serious version, or it can be travesty in a comedy. And that's what I'd like to suggest for our Fliax crater in Bari, namely that the story that's being played out here is that Tyndareus has come to suspect his wife of infidelity, particularly when this egg shows up. He knows that the egg is not his, or the child inside of it is not his. And so he gets very riled up and comes to attack newborn Helen with an axe. Nita hides because she's under suspicion and is rather frantic. And the slave, who presumably was in cahoots with Nita and perhaps furnished the basket, puts his arm up and says, "Halt, stop." And again, the story would have a happy ending if Helen was injured. But what the painter has given us is the kind of climactic moment in a comedy based on the birth of Helen. I will just show a few more things that this wonderful scene, which I had, not a great slide, but it's a slide that I took many years ago because I was so struck by this Helen breaking out of her egg. But you sort of think of those Las Vegas shows beyond Lady Gaga, where the naked woman bursts out of some contraption. You hear the drum beat. And now, having studied the vase in Bari, it seems to me that the gestures in this scene are very significant, and they too refer to this same comic version, namely Tyndareus rubbing his beard in amazement at what is happening, and Leda, in a very unusual gesture that scholars have debated, the few that have written about this vase. But I would like to read this. Gestures are notoriously difficult to interpret in Greek vase painting. But I would like to interpret this with the one arm across her chest and the other one as a kind of gesture of studied nonchalance. That as Tyndareus puzzles over what is going on here with this child bursting out of an egg, Leda's reaction is something like, "Don't ask me, this is the first I've seen." Again, her guilty conscience, knowing that this child is hers. Before I end, I want to just observe how how the viewer, the ancient viewer of a vase such as this crater at Bari, would have made associations that are probably not so obvious to us. So, for example, seeing the character with his raised axe, he would think of the axe in the hand of Hephaestus, god, at the birth of Athena. Or seeing this wicker basket, or she, the ancient viewer, would think of a myth in which a basket plays a big role. And this is another Fliax, which I'll come back to in a moment. But in fact, this myth, which I won't go to in detail, that is set in Athens, a sort of divine child is born out of the earth. Athena takes up the child, and she entrusts him to these three girls who are not supposed to peek into the basket, but they do. And here you can make out that this is, again, a basket not too different from the one we've seen, but here wrapped up in snakes, and the girls are punished by Athena. But what I'm saying is that these visual motifs operated on their own, and the ancient viewer would make all these associations. And this, do I have a detail of it? Yeah. This is, I think, again, a Fleax, a comic parody of that myth. And the child, whose name is Erichthonius in the myth, is caricatured in a rather bizarre way with a ram's head and an enormous phallus, with the typical, and maybe these are the takeoff on the daughters, the girls who are supposed to watch basket. This is my last image, Steve, and I want to leave you with the thought that these vases are beautiful to look at and technically very accomplished, but their imagery is often we have lost the keys to the images. They are in the form of literary sources that are lost to us, and this to me is what makes the study of these vases so exciting and interesting. So I think I will stop there. Maybe you do one question.
Yes. Thank you, Alan. So we have time for some questions. Yes,
we can find an image.
I don't know which of these, Joe, do you know which of these two is John?
Yeah, I think they're both equally not perfect for our purposes.
Go back to this one case.
Well, I was, this is fascinating, and I'm always interested in the electronic images, the composition of the bases, and I would love to know
That thing.
rectangular.
Yeah.
What is that?
I
Do we
really
know?
puzzled over that. At one point I thought a window, because we sometimes see things hanging on an imaginary wall in the background of three faces. And yet it, do you have any insight?
I thought the same. The setting seems to be, it would be palatial, and the door suggests that as well, with the studding and there's almost a kind of perspective that suggests the window is rather deep. So
Sure.
I think wall of a monumental building, but that's just kind of personal impression.
There's a lot of, you're right, there's not usually much architecture on these vases, so a very detailed doorway. And what's so wonderful about a vase like this is that because it shows a play in performance, which Athenian artists never do, it helps us to imagine things like sets, props, costumes that would have been used. I saw one. Well, go ahead.
Alan, back on the vase where Zeus is actually the swan, St. Diva.
Yeah.
And then there's the goddess. The goddess thing with like kind of a whip or a.
Oh yeah, this one.
No, sorry, down on half of that vase.
Oh,
The lower
oh,
register.
Okay, let me go find that again.
Yeah.
So this was Hypnos, the sleep god.
Yeah, is there any gesture he has with that whip? Is he?
Yes, I think that's a good point, which I neglected, but he's holding a long, thin rod, and I wouldn't go as far as call it a whip, but more like it could be a brand. But there is a Greek term that works very well here, called a rapidos. A rapidos can be any kind of long rod, which could have magical properties. So what I'm imagining is that this is the way he hypnotizes her, is through that rapidos.
museum vacancies?
Well, to that extent, yes. I mean, the whole point, I think, of this scene is to reframe the story away from being a rape, as it was in the statuary, where Lita is naked and it's, you could say they're caught in flagrante delicto, to a romanticized, positive spin on the story in which Lita's rape becomes a metaphor, I said, for being taken up to the gods. Yeah.
I just wanted some clarification on how, well, we know that the Nemesis and Zeus are supposed to be the birth parents of Helen, and we spoke about Euripides and
Right,
changing it to Leda and the Swan Zeus.
Right.
Where was that? Just Euripides who did that, or is that actually a just like kind of segmented form of myth?
We can't, I can't be absolutely certain, but my working hypothesis is that Euripides invented this new version, and it spread, it became wildly popular with visual artists, so with the statue, with vase painters, but I guess we often are under this impression that Greek myths are sort of timeless. They all go back to some legend, mythical time. But the truth is far from that. The myths are constantly being invented and reshaped, particularly by great artists like Euripides, authors, poets. And the great thing about these vases is they can sort of give us the time frame. Like, obviously, if there were a depiction of Leda and the Swan before Euripides' play, then we couldn't credit him with it. But in fact, there is no depiction until a couple of decades, let's say, after Euripides' time. So I think we can make that working hypothesis. The slide got cut off, unfortunately, but notice this charming motif of Eros watering a young deer. I sort of wondered if that's kind of a little wry comment on this human and animal coupling that we see. This is clearly a very carefully thought out object.
What are those things in the top, that UFO over there? That matter.
This one is pretty clear that it's a mirror, a bronze or gilded mirror, which could be a lot of women are shown holding mirrors. This one has been the subject of a lot of discussion. It has been referred to as a xylophone, although it's a little hard to know what it is doing here. These South Italian vases are filled with symbols that are poorly understood today. By a sort of roundabout route, I think that this xylophone could be connected with Orpheus, the mythical singer, and that this entire vase is viewed with references to Orpheus and to the mysteries at Eleusis. This figure is labeled as Eleusis, where the great Eleusinian mysteries took place. So there's a lot more going on here.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. Great talk.
Pleasure.